Hello, Champion Brewing. Hello, people that are participating in the Global Game Jam and people that aren't and asking what the heck's going on. We are RVA Game Jams, and this weekend is Global Game Jam. If you're not familiar with it, Global Game Jam is a 48-hour event where we try to make a game. We try to make a complete video game. We're given a theme and try to make a game around it. We cooperate with these fine sponsors. I'd like to thank Champion Brewing, obviously, as well as VCU Arts, Kinetic Imaging. We got a lot of KI people here. What about other VCU Arts? VCU Arts in general, let me hear it. All right. And then also VCU Libraries will be hosting the proper jam itself. Would like to thank them. But yeah, like Mina said, if you're a veteran jammer, we have stickers to identify yourself with. We also have name tags. And on top of that, we have skill sheets. So what we do for Global Game Jam, it's more of a team-run event. And so you pick up one of these skill sheets that Moment's holding up right now. Oh no, he's holding up the skill sheet. And then you fill out what skills that you are familiar with, what you're good at, and then we try to pair you off with people of complementary skills so you guys can make a game together. So it's usually 2D art, 3D art, programming, music, etc. Right, so if you haven't done it, please do it now so we can get you guys organized into groups while the speaker speaks. But on that note, I would like to introduce our guest speaker this year, which is Clint, Halfcoordinated Lexa. Let's give it up for Clint. Oh, he's already so excited to talk. I can tell. Clint, if you're not familiar, goes by the handle Halfcoordinated. He is a speedrunner, streamer, and accessibility advocate. He speedruns games one-handed. He was at Awesome Games Done Quick earlier this month, speedrunning Semblance, indie game by Nyamakop out of South Africa. And it was really cool. You should have been there. I was there. So I care. But yeah, we invited Clint up. He's a Virginia native here to talk about kind of his experiences with talking about accessibility in gaming and speedrunning and streaming. So without further ado, Eric, I need a wave of a hand. Are we good up there? Okay, good. Thank you, Eric. Without further ado, here is Halfcoordinated.
Might need to raise the volume a bit. Okay, I'll turn it up.
So I'm really nervous, just to let you all know up front. And I'm also operating this. He gave me an excellent introduction, so shout outs to Dylan just right away, because that frees up a little bit of what I have to say. But I am operating under the assumption that, well, one, you don't know who I am, because you've probably made better life choices. So as he said, Halfcoordinated, and I speedrun games one-handed. The reason that I do that is I have a physical disability called hemiparesis that lowers feeling and coordination on the entire right side of my body. So it just happened to be the better way for me to play, especially ever since, say, I've been playing games all my life, but ever since I got a PS2, because that's where the controller kind of started to work out for me to actually play one-handed. Because unfortunately I had an N64 instead of a PS1, the famous three-handed controller. So that didn't work out in that particular case. But from there, I eventually led into speedrunning. So if you're unfamiliar with speedrunning, that's playing a game as fast as you possibly can. Either completing the game entirely or just reaching a certain goal or getting everything. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can approach speedrunning, but with the goal of completing it quickly and often kind of running the game over and over to kind of bring that time down and be competitive with other players. So I've been doing that since 2012 is when I got my start with that. And I've had 8 Games Done Quick runs since 2015. And it's all been a different game each time. I've ran several games by Platinum Games like Nier Automata, Vanquish, and Transformers Devastation, and then several indie games like Momodora, Reverie Under the Moonlight, and Semblance, which Dylan mentioned I did this year. It has been a little bit of an awkward thing existing in that sort of competitive space while having a physical disability, because you're trying to push a game as far as you can, but you're kind of starting with a little less. But speedrunning has also been an excellent community for that, because it's not directly competitive. It's something where we're working together to bring the game's time down rather than against each other. So you're all kind of rooting for each other, even if you are competing. So it's kind of lovely in that way. So existing in that space, that's sort of what led to my accessibility advocacy, getting to go on that stage for GDQ and kind of show that, hey, you can do these amazing things as long as the game actually lets you. And sometimes the game doesn't let you. So I really tried to talk about that when I can. And that advocacy went into eventually accessibility consultation. I got contacted by Jason Kanam from Household Games after a run of mine in 2016. And I helped consult for their game Way of the Passive Fist, which is a wonderful pun of a name that I'm just very proud of them thinking of. So I consulted with that game, and I've done a few others, some pro bono stuff before that as well. But it's something I really just want to help as many games as possible, reach as many different needs as possible to people to play them. So it led me to here. Eventually, somehow, I ended up here. And so talking about accessibility, but what is it? It's basically the ease of access for those with disabilities for your games. Physical, such as motor disabilities, such as my own, and cognitive disabilities, so ones that would have issues with overstimulation or following large or complex commands. And visual, such as blindness or just poor vision, uncorrectable vision, or color blindness, and audio. So there's a lot that can go into making your game as accessible as possible for as many people to play it as possible. And that, again, ranges from... So getting your game accessible ranges from features such as remappable controls. Be ready for me to say remappable controls several times throughout this talk, because it's sort of my specialty area. And say clear subtitles are just a big one as well, if that happens to apply to your game. And you might be thinking at this point, that sounds like a lot of work, a lot of effort. We're going to be making a game in 48 hours. How the heck are we supposed to, care about this while we're just trying to work that miracle of getting a game put together within that short time frame? And, that's a valid question. Luckily for everyone, though, often good design happens to be accessible design. So just going through a bunch of examples here. So for one, you want to avoid using cues to the player that are either purely visual or purely audio. You want to try and pair those together as often as you can so that those that are either hard of hearing or visual issues can get that cue through what they do have available to them. And that's just generally a good design tip, because multiple cues make it more likely for anyone to pick up on what you are trying to present to the player. Similarly, avoid color being the only distinction between multiple objects. So, for example, if you have collectible items, or you have objects that the player can interact with, you want to try and make sure there is some other distinction other than just color to make so the player can distinguish those multiple things. So, for example, say there's multiple objects that the player can choose from and they have different effects. If you only have it as color, the player might not know what those different effects are until after they've activated them, because they can't tell the difference if they are colorblind. Good big thing for that, you can test for colorblind issues as well within your design of your game, just with, say, visual design settings available in, say, Photoshop, or as well as there is a program you can download for free. I promise it's not spyware or adware. It's at colororacle.org, and you can ask me about that later. Perfectly fine. It's a program that you just kind of sits in your taskbar after you open it, and you can click on it, and it will present a screen simulating 3 major types of color blindness. So you can use that to kind of compare what the level, your screen actually looks like to a colorblind player, and say, hey, that actually doesn't stand out very well. I should probably shift a few things around. So you have that option available to you. Excellent little program to use. So always with that, a big thing with that colorblindness is try to consider especially interactive objects and the background in particular from each other, because that's the main thing. If you have some issues within, say, one sprite, that's usually negligible, but if it's something where that whole sprite disappears in your background, then that becomes a much more major issue. Sorry, as I reference my notes, really should get better handwriting. Continuing with visuals, I would suggest, and this is a stylistic choice going here, is to try and avoid bright full screen flashes and overly chaotic visuals in your game. That is something that a lot of games that I love actually tend to do. I mean, one of my favorite games of all time is Gunstar Heroes, and that has a bunch of flashes, a bunch of action happening all the time. But it's something where, maybe not for this jam, but if you were doing a full game, you could have an option to turn those sort of effects off. Because these sorts of effects, those flashes, those can cause photosensitive headaches, and they can also be an issue for those with cognitive disabilities where it becomes too much of a processing load mentally for that player. So with more visual stuff, text. You want to make it big, clear, simple. Avoid extravagant fonts. Those can be disorienting and hard for players to read. So of course you can style it up a little bit, but try and keep it clear so that it's, well, clear what the player needs to do. And here, something that possibly game jams excel at excel at the most, minimize the amount of inputs required to actually start the game. So a lot of games I would probably expect might just drop you right in this case, or you will likely just have a start option to select within your game, and that's generally actually good design to be able to let a player drop right in, again, for cognitive reasons and physical reasons, to make sure you don't have to go through a lot of a menu. If you do have customizable settings, though, which, again, you're trying to put one whole game together as quickly as possible, so I understand if you don't end up having that. But if you do, try and have those settings available before you actually get into the game, or if you are dropped right in, make it so that you can pause and change those as soon as possible. And so going through that, then controls, again, that tends to be my personal focus. I'm practically required to state, it's basically my job to say that full remapping for controls is always the best. But I fully understand that you likely won't have time for that. You're going to be busy with a whole lot of other things today. And, well, actually this weekend, excuse me. So with that in mind, a good alternative is to provide several different ways to perform each action. So if you so let's say your game is keyboard only. You want to try and make it so that you have multiple different keys that can do each action so that someone that is playing standardly with two hands can play, someone that has to play with only their right hand can play, and someone that's playing with just their left hand could still reach all of the commands to be able to successfully play your game. And so that's, as an example, if possible, support multiple input devices such as controllers as well. I personally do almost all of my gaming with a controller. I would love to be able to try your games. But if it ends up, that you can't use a controller and it's something basic on the keyboard, I should be able to fare along okay. But controllers are kind of little wonderful tools in my opinion, and if you have the skills for that to be possible in your game, please include it if you have the time. So again, I understand I might be asking a lot, but it's partially my job to ask as much as possible. So going with controls as well, avoid mashing. So mashing mashing being pressing a button repeatedly as fast as you possibly can. Avoid that. That can be very difficult for a lot of players to physically do, as well as impossible for some other people to do. So you want to try and keep that out of your game if possible. Similarly, try to avoid requiring a player to hold down a button for an extremely long period of time. A solution for both of these might be something where you could have an option be toggleable instead of having it be so you press it once and then it's active. Let's say you're making a basic shmup, then that shmup you could have just press the button to start firing, press it again to stop. So that's an example of a solution for avoiding both mashing or having to hold down a button continuously. So try to avoid complicating your controls as much as you can, just using as many required inputs as needed. It's something I see a lot of with games, say, for example, to activate some super move or something where they'll have you press like both trigger buttons or something like that on the controller at once. And sometimes that's the only option they have, given what they've designed for. But if you have just one button available, make it one button instead. So try to not overly complicate what you're going for. There are certain genres where designers tend to purposefully make the controls a little harder to work with, such as horror games, because that becomes an element of the horror. But try to keep it to a limit, because again, you could be shutting people out from even trying to play your game at all if you go too far with that. Also, if it is a mouse game, so if mouse is the primary form of control, I would advise to try and include a setting to actually adjust the sensitivity of the mouse, because people might be playing with something other than a mouse, something that simulates it, a different kind of input device to actually be able to play your game at all. So that's something big to consider. For example, it could be using eye tracking software, and you might need more sensitivity or less. There's a lot of different ways that people will likely be trying to play your game. And also with that, avoid requiring multiple unrelated input devices to actually get started in the game. If it's possible for a controller to be used in your game, don't require them to use the keyboard and mouse to go through the menus. So, and vice versa. Make sure that they can use whatever they're using to control your game in the end to get there and actually start your game. So that kind of covers basics, and again, hopefully you'll have questions for me later, but going into, so if you were making a regular on a regular kind of dev cycle, you were trying to make a full game, on a regular time frame, not putting it all together in 48 hours, when should you start considering accessibility? You can probably predict that my answer is immediately. You should try to think about accessibility right away. As soon, just when you're coming up with the idea of what your game is going to be, that's when it should be considered. reasoning behind this, while some features such as custom remapping for controls can be recommended for just about every game in existence, there will be many possible features dependent on the game's actual design. For example, hopefully you've all heard of Celeste. Maybe you haven't, but just to describe a little bit, it's a precision platformer that you're climbing a mountain through a lot of very fast, precise movement. And the game happens to have a wealth of amazing accessibility features such as infinite dashes, invincibility, slowing the game down. These are all just excellent features that they have. But a lot of those, like infinite dashes, you don't need that if you're making a turn-based RPG. That's irrelevant then. So instead, it might be great to have an option to make the UI larger so that someone can more easily interact and view all of those different options they have for fighting the monsters in there. So it's going to depend on the design of your game, what precise features are really going to get you the most mileage. So that's part of why I've been so general with what I've discussed so far. But if these sort of challenges are considered from the start, right away when you're putting the game together or just thinking about what the game is going to be, it's much easier to prepare your game for them. So, for example, let's say you were making a precision platformer like Celeste, and so there's that infinite dashing mechanic that they added in. Let's say, or if they hadn't considered that from early on, you can code yourself into a corner and be unable to add such a feature later, or it can become then a lot of work to actually add that feature. If you start from the beginning considering accessibility, you can actually have that in your game much easier and just kind of code for that in mind, and it becomes much, much easier to implement, taking very little time and resources to actually add into your game. And that's great for you, and often it ends up making those features much better in the end and more complete into your game's design. So that makes a huge difference for both you and in the game with the players. So again, you can end up with features being too locked in place if you consider too late. So I've talked a lot about accessibility, but why should you care? And I hate having to ask that question, but I feel it is relevant. About 15% of the population are disabled in some way. That's a lot of potential players. It can also assist with temporary issues, such as, say, in a broken arm, you can have controls that allow someone to play one-handed comfortably. Or situational, like just trying to be quiet at night, so you have to play with it muted and subtitles turned on. These are all accessible features that matter for your game. As mentioned, with good design being accessible design, accessibility features tend to help and enhance games for almost everyone. It's rare and honestly very baffling to see someone complain about rebindable controls in a game. I can't think of a reason why someone would be upset that they could change a button's function. So it's just very common, even with those without disabilities, to want to move one action to a different button or switch things around just a little bit. And I do want to mention, because with rebindable controls, one thing that often gets forgotten and something you won't really have time for this weekend, but to keep in mind later, is actually the control sticks on a controller often get forgotten and kind of are just left alone. Not everyone actually holds the controller in the same direction. I know plenty of people that hold them sideways or upside down because of how their physical needs require them to. So being able to remap the control sticks to actually face the direction that they're holding would help them not have to do mental gymnastics just to figure out how to move left or right or any direction, really. So with all of this, I would be remiss to not mention, and I'm going to be going off my notes a little more tightly here, to not mention that the end goal of accessibility is not just to allow play to happen, but to instead enable someone to actually excel. And that actually gets missed a lot because there's a tendency to say, oh, well, that's good enough. But we've hopefully all been there, if you play games at all. We've hopefully all been there at some point where you're just in the zone playing a game. You're really into it, and everything's flowing just right for you. And you really want that experience to go to as many people as possible. And if the controls or the interface or the sound, if it becomes work for that person to play your game, then they're not going to get to that point. They're not going to excel, and they're just not going to have that great of a time. So that becomes your responsibility to try and make that possible at all. So wrapping up the part where I'm just saying words at you, there's a lot of great resources out there that you could possibly even reference this weekend. I did mention Color Oracle for that, colororacle.org for that tool for color blindness. There's also GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com. It's a great resource that lists a wide variety of accessibility features with examples, breaking them down by ease of implementation, so it'll be basic, intermediate, and advanced. So even if you just kind of stick to what's basic this weekend, that can help get your game a lot more accessible overall. There's also ablegamers.org. It's a wonderful charity. I know quite a few people from them that they actually make controllers, custom controllers for those that need them to be able to play with, say, excessive motor disabilities, and they work within the industry to make it so that's less needed over time. And they do an excellent job. So looking into them over time, just some people, and I can mention to these later if you're curious, at Ian Hamilton, which is just Ian Hamilton on Twitter for the reference, at Ian Hamilton _ accessibility specialist. He is an organizer for the Game Accessibility Conference, which happens alongside GDC, and just has a wealth of information on his own about accessibility and what good practices are. Stephen Spohn is the COO of AbleGamers, a good friend. We were both actually survivors of being nominated for Trending Gamer of the Year. And I don't use the word survivor lightly, but so that was a thing that happened. But good friends before and after that, thankfully. Cherry Ray, who is at Cherry, RAE. She is a consultant as well, particularly with physical and simulatory issues. And she's also a streamer as well. By the way, I do a lot of streaming. So that's just associated with speedrunning. But that's a major thing. There's also for hard of hearing access, there's at Deaf Gamers TV and at One Odd Gamer Girl. They're both deaf and hard of hearing advocacy. So they know a lot for those particular issues. And maybe you want to talk to someone local about accessibility issues. There is your own Ruthie Edwards, who is in the crowd. There's Ruthie. Ruthie, I bet she would just love to talk to you about accessibility if you have questions at some other time. She gave me a thumbs up, so I don't feel awkward about calling her out on that now. But so that's good. And there's also me. I'm here all weekend. I'm at Halfcoordinated. Hi. You can feel free to ask me questions specifically regarding accessibility or streaming, speedrunning, a whole wealth of stuff. You feel free to just ask me questions, and with that, I'd love to open up the floor for questions. To make a game speedrun friendly. Okay, yeah, no, that often when I end up consulting for accessibility, I also end up being a speedrun consultant just by happenstance for games. So speedrun friendly, that's going to depend a lot on the individual player and their preferences. But one, you want to make it easy and painless for them to reset and do a new attempt of your game. So so I would advise against, say, a huge long cutscene or unskippable cutscene at the start of your game, explaining some story, for example. I feel that's something where I can recommend, again, rebindable controls. Those tend to help a lot of speedrunners as well. But with design, a lot of speedrunners tend to like there being some sort of advanced movement tech to your game. That's a common preference, just for there to be something where you can tell that you're doing something just right to make yourself move faster. It can be as simple as just like a roll and a jump or whatever, or some sort of dash, just some way that you can really feel engaged with those controls as you're moving around. If it is a game with movement, of course, that becomes kind of a prerequisite there for that explanation. You know, I should have been more prepared to answer that question, I think, but it is hard because there's a lot of different preferences, like I mentioned, because, say, for example, there are speedrunners that love that their game to be go all the time, like never stop, no breaks. And then there's me. I speedran Hob for a while. I might have not heard of that game, but it has a lot of like unskippable things where I'm just watching something in the world move or going down an elevator. I love those little like 30-second to a minute breaks in Control, just for me to take a break and kind of recalibrate myself, really. So that's kind of, and maybe that's just part of me getting older too, but it's something to consider. I think it's good for to make it an easy game to get into for speedrunning, to not have huge penalties for mistakes as well. So say if you mess up at the very end of a level and it just sends you way back to the beginning, you know, that means that that runner has, unless it's like their first couple of attempts at it, they're going to have to reset and start all over. And depending on the player, that can really discourage them from continuing. So try to not have really harsh setbacks when you do die or make some sort of movement mistake in your game. Yeah. Next question, I suppose. So what games have I played that I've had the best speedrunning experience with? Okay. Yes. So for me, I mentioned Hob. I really liked Hob. It's not really probably the best example of what people would think of when they think of a speed game, but it has a lot of little neat movement tech, like I mentioned, where say you do a thrust attack with your sword and you cancel that with a roll, and all of a sudden the momentum from the thrust gets carried into the roll and you're going faster, and then you can cancel that with a jump to jump way farther than you're supposed to. There ends up being these little skips and actually some major skips that result from this unexpected movement, and it's really satisfying to pull off. And there was nothing so complicated in that game that I wasn't able to do that. Like I mentioned, I'm playing the controls one-handed. There are some games where I'll end up hitting a wall with the controls. Say, Nier Automata, the speedrun for the game, the controls, especially now, I've stopped speedrunning it since, but it became very complicated, very high actions per minute, lots of inputs to have to pull that off, and I kind of hit a wall with that eventually. But Hob was one where I never really hit that specific wall. It was more of a wall of my patience with the game. Say Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight, which is probably the game most people have known me for. I ended up having some difficulty with just keeping up with some general movement, but it was still a wonderful game to play. It was fairly simple to overall the movement, but it just kind of, I eventually hit a wall with that as well. But that's okay, because I like to move from one game to the next. So I have a habit of playing one game and just grinding out attempts for a long time, and then kind of moving on and playing something else, finding another game. Because my reason to speedrun is generally just, wow, I really like this game. I want to play it more. And that's my excuse. A lot of people will go and collect everything, and and there are people who do that in speedruns, 100% speedruns. I don't tend to do that. I just want to do it fast and see how good I can do that. I kind of got derailed on that, so I do apologize. But I would have to pick Hob as my just favorite experience of a game itself. If it's just an experience of speedrunning overall, it's getting to get on the stage for Games Done Quick events, because that's where I get to have the most impact for speaking with accessibility, even if it is just a quick thing that I say after the run, having that impact and also that representation for disability within the the speedrunning space. It means a lot to me to be able to do that. So, next. Oh gosh, so if I could only play one video game for the rest of my life, that's a really tough follow-up question after I just said I like to skip from game to game. Oh my. One game. Oh my gosh. Gunstar Heroes for the Sega Genesis. I don't speedrun it. I'll never speedrun it. The reason, and I'll tell you why I don't speedrun it, is because the best way to play that game is... Okay, step back. Let's explain Gunstar Heroes for a second. Gunstar Heroes is a game that kind of combines Contra and Kirby together. So it's a run and gun game, but you can pick up different powers and combine those powers into one. And how you speedrun that game is you pick up the fire and the tracer ability, which then lets you control a flamethrower all over the screen. And you get that over the boss, and then you mash circles on the D-pad to keep it on the boss as much as possible. It would destroy my thumb. But casually, just an excellent game I could play forever. So, next question. So are there any groups that certify accessibility in games, and is there room for growth in that? Okay, making sure. So there are multiple groups that do work with that. Of course, I mentioned Able Gamers. So they do a lot with the industry to try and help, like the big names, Sony and Microsoft and, Nintendo, but we'll give them a little bit of side eye to Nintendo. But they work with a lot of them to try and help them determine what will actually help reach the most people. There are other groups. There's Daggers, D-A-G-E-R-S. It's an acronym. I can't remember exactly what for, but they're a consultation group as well. And it's odd to say, with growth in this aspect, of course, there's plenty of growth because there's a lot of accessibility work to be done within making games more accessible, both with the tools used to make those games and within the games themselves, and then the tools that the players have access to as well. So there's plenty of growth in a lot of areas, and honestly, the past few years have been great for that. There has been a lot of growth. I mean, for one, I'm here now. I'm talking to you about accessibility. A few years ago, I don't think that would have been the case for this sort of opportunity, this sort of care for this subject to even exist. So it's really hopeful, and it's kind of weird that I'm going to say this, but our main hope as we do this is almost to put myself out of a job. Because eventually everyone will just understand accessibility so well that I won't really be needed except for sort of offhanded questions. Hopefully I'll be stable enough by that time, but that's our end goal. So yeah, lots of growth. There's a lot of people out there. I don't think there's an official board. There are certain things that, that are, and there are people that definitely could answer that better. There are certain regulations that now games are having to meet. I believe it's CVAA is something where games are having to meet certain regulations now for communications for those that are hard of hearing, and that's kind of creating a block on some multiplayer online games. I know Ian Hamilton I mentioned. He would be a go-to. He's definitely talks a lot about that. So, next question. Wonderful question. So the question was, of all the controllers I've used, what is my favorite of all time? And this is going to be a shame because Razer doesn't sponsor me, but it is a Razer Wildcat Xbox One controller. With that, the Razer Wildcat is their kind of augury to the Elite controller for Xbox One you may have heard of, which has kind of extra buttons and paddles and whatnot on it. What makes me prefer the Wildcat, which I think they've even phased out of production, they've replaced it with the Wolverine, because everything has to be a fierce animal, apparently. But what I really love about the Wildcat is it does have some extra buttons on it. I actually have one in my bag back there. But it has buttons at the top of the controller, so I never explained how I hold a controller. How I tend to hold a controller, especially for those that have a lot of different inputs on them, is I will hold it still with my right hand or just have it on my lap, and I will put my palm over the left control stick and do the movements that way. My thumb will press the face buttons and move the right control stick, and then all the rest of my fingers, depending on what's exactly happening, will handle the buttons at the top of the controller. Now, the Razer Wildcat in particular has 2 extra buttons basically over top on the sides of the middle of the top of the controller, and you can program those buttons to be any other input on the controller, including D-pad functions. And I love that so much. Often I'll just have those set to X and Y so that my thumb can just rest on A and B while I'm just moving and kind of just anchor myself. And that's excellent, but it depends on what game I'm playing. And it's not a separate program that you use to control that. You actually just remap it on the controller itself, and it can save 2 separate profiles. And I really like that controller a lot. It does also have triggers on the back of the controller, which I can't use, but they're removable. I can just take them off with screws. So I really love that controller. It's my favorite. Thanks for that question. Next. What was that? I'm partial to 2B over A2 in that respect. They're both great, though. That was a near automata question for anyone that is not in the loop. My favorite soundtrack. Oh, that's great for the first question. How to make a good speed game. Have good music. Because they're going to listen to your music over and over. And you want to make sure they don't get tired of the sounds in your game. So good music or just soothing sounds. I like a lot of really chill stuff. But favorite game soundtrack? I'm going to go with Celeste. I mean, I see people nodding in approval of that selection. Lena Raine did an excellent job, and then, the B-sides, a lot of other people put in excellent work as well, such as Krista Lee. I know both of them, so, but it's great, and it just fits the game so well, and you can listen to it. It's still great not playing the game, which is kind of a high bar sometimes, because there are some games where the music just fits what you're doing, but you will never listen to it otherwise. Like, say, Vanquish, music fits perfectly for what I'm doing in that game, but I don't really want to listen to it outside of it. But yeah, so Celeste. Can you repeat that one? I actually have not played a lot of games with touchpads, even to the extent that, say, for PS4 games, I actually use an Xbox One controller with an adapter so that I don't deal with that touchpad on that controller, because it messes with my whole grip over the entire top of the controller thing. But for like touchpad games, like say iPad or Android, I don't do a whole lot of that. What I have, because often a lot of touchpad games will assume that you can press both sides of the screen at once, which is really bad for me in particular. There are some single input games that I have played, and I'm actually blanking on the names of them right now, which makes me feel really bad, but that's my fault, not yours. But it was something UFO. It was designed by the people that make Kirby, but I really liked that one. Oh, God. Yes, Part-Time UFO. That's the one. Part-Time UFO. I really liked that game. It was really simple. I even streamed that one. I pumped my tablet through my capture card to actually stream it, which was an experience. But that was pretty good. Yeah. So it depends. Like, so if it's a very simple controls, like just one input like that, it's definitely very accessible. But if you are expecting someone to be able to press both sides of a tablet at once, that becomes more of a problem. Like, say, my standard grip doesn't work then because my hand is over what I'm supposed to look at. So, yeah. Any more? Oh, I missed. Orb. Key. Yes, orb. That's someone that's watched me play Semblance. So I'll let you in on that in joke. If maybe you watched AGDQ a little bit and you watched it later and you're like, why is everyone shouting orb every chance they have? The category I ran for Semblance was all orbs. So I collected over 70 orbs over the course of that run. And to explain further, it's a kind of a joke within the Super Mario World community to say orb like this, orb, whenever you pick up an orb to finish a level. Whenever you finish the level like that. And there were some people watching my run that are in that community, and they just started doing that for every single orb pickup, and it just continued throughout the entire week-long event, expanding to other games. And I've seen so many people on Twitter, on YouTube, like, why are people saying orb? It's my fault, I'm sorry. But anything else? Yay. I'm clapping for myself.